So I think as you go through this, as you study, as you learn more, just remember that we're all students and we can all contribute. And I really encourage people to come and help us because we have a lot still to do. Volume 2, Volume 3, right? So thank you for being here, and I know you're going to have a great time. Take care.
Good.
Bye.
Thanks, Dee.
Okay. As Dee said, we did have a great time. It was a lot of work, but we really had fun working on the book. It was, I felt it was a labor of love. And I hope also that beside this class being informative, that we're going to have some fun too. The classes I run are very informal. I want you to ask me questions as we go. I don't care if you interrupt me, that's fine. I don't want to wait till the end. We have 121 artists to cover in 6 classes. So I've divided that into 20. So we're going to cover 20 artists today, or we're going to try. I also hope to be able to, if we have time, to go up and look at the real pieces as opposed to just what we're going to see on the screen, because I think that'll be, you're going to be able to see texture and other things that I think are going to be really good. A couple of things in mind. In 2010, the National Trust for Historic Preservation designated Provincetown home of the nation's oldest art colony. So right on Cape Cod, we have this very rich national treasure. And a good deal of the artists that we're going to look at had a connection with Provincetown and were very active members of the art colony. But there are some, like Charles Cahoon was Harwich, and there's somebody in Falmouth and somebody in Orleans. So, but basically, the bulk of it is, you're going to find as we go through it, will have very strong connections to specifically Provincetown, but also the Cape. And the Cape Cod Museum of Art is, you know, their mission is to collect art that was associated with the Cape in some way or another. There are a couple of artists that may have very tenuous connections to the Cape. And that may be that we'll find one that they were here for 2 days or something, but there are a few, not many as far as I know. What is interesting is when Dee and I went through the collection, we singled out these 121 artists, and we had certain criteria. The criteria we used was the importance of the artist in terms of reputation that went, first of all, beyond the Cape. And there are many artists that fall into that category. And then artists that represent major art movements in, say, the 20th century, artists that had a strong influence on the type of art done on the Cape, or had an influence on what went beyond the Cape. So, and of the 121 artists we selected for the book, 100 of them, when I was doing the research, 100, maybe a few more than 100, are artists whose works are in major museum collections. And when you go through the book, I made a point of doing that research, and at the end of each bio, I included when the artist was represented in major collections. And when I'm talking about major, I'm talking about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art in Whitney, the Guggenheim in LA County, and the Art Institute of Chicago, all over, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So all the major museums, the National Gallery, Smithsonian, those are all museums that have work by artists who are also in the museum collection. So I think that's pretty significant. Also, after we had selected the artists and I started working on it, I realized that I actually interviewed 50 of the 121 at one time or another. So I'm going to be able to, not in the beginning because I don't go back that far, but I'll be able to add some personal kinds of things about, you know, when we talked. Other things that we should recognize is, and I guess of the 50, then there were another 25 that I had done previous research on. which is not to say I didn't have a lot of work to do to put this together, but I had at least a lot of background. Couple of things, housekeeping. Number one, this will go for 2 hours. Do we feel we want a break? Anybody know if, you know, okay. Because usually, the classes I've run, people don't want it, but if you do, we could break for 5 minutes. I also hope we'll have time to, at the end, a few minutes, at least to go around and look at the real art. And the other thing is, on the next to last class, October 20, there's the 20th anniversary Boston Fine Arts show. And it opens on the 20th of October. Miller White, 4 galleries from the Cape are going to be there, beside galleries in Pennsylvania and Maine and Rhode Island. It's pretty interesting. If you're interested in art, it might be worth seeing. However, Miller White, the gallery I'm connected to, is going to be there. And I've been, Susan asked me to show some of my work. So I would like, with that as a precedent, I'd like to reschedule that class from 10:30 to 12:30, if that works for everybody. The 20th.
On 10:20?
It's the same day.
Yeah, it's 10:20. It's this next to the last class. So it'll be 10:30 to 12:30 if that works. I checked with Benton and he said that was fine. So that will give me time to avoid the traffic. Okay, so we'll start with Audubon, which is kind of interesting because he's the only artist in the book who was born in the 18th century. He was born in 1785. And he was not technically, and this is something we can discuss, he was not technically a fine artist. He was a scientist. He was an ornithologist. He wanted to document the birds of America. He was also a wonderful artist, as you can see. So what he did was very painstakingly, as you can see how exacting his work was, he made the effort to do this. He came up with 435 life-sized drawings or paintings, mostly watercolor. But they actually, and these are the birds of America, they actually were not, interestingly enough, printed initially in America. They were printed first in Edinburgh and then in London. And then he proceeded to do another volume. But here are the pieces in our collection, and the first 4 you're going to see, as you'll see, he put them in an environment. And you could see, and there is one piece right outside. It might be this one. So these, not only did he do these birds with these wonderful feathers and everything, but captured the grass and the background, and how beautifully he did. But the last one, he isolated these wood ducks, so that you could really see, but you could see how precise he was. And so we say, okay, when we think of birds, we think of Audubon. But his primary motive was not to be involved in an art movement or to create art. It was a scientific effort, an illustration. But in the context of what is being done today, anything is art. I mean, whether it could be a carcass in formaldehyde or some video or some other installation, we've all seen those kinds of things that we look at as saying, weird, is this art? So that's a whole other question, which maybe we'll have time to explore at the end. So then we move into, the book was done chronologically based on their date of birth. It was the only way we, when Jeannie and I tried to figure out how we were going to organize the book, we thought that that was the best way to do it because first we thought we will do it based on style, Impressionism or Modernism or Cubism or whatever, but we would have been going all over the place. So we figured if we did it chronologically by the date of birth of the artist, you're going to see a progression of art moving from very traditional approaches to abstraction as we go along. So, and you're actually going to see some abstraction in this first class because there were some early artists, mostly women, who were very influenced by modernism, and they brought it. They had been to Paris, and they brought it back. So here's John Joseph Enneking. He studied, and oh, I have to let me go back here. This is a painting he did before he went to Paris to study. Very traditional. And then as we move along, you see he was influenced by the Barbizon painters, who were a group of painters that painted in the forest of Fontainebleau in a village called Barbizon, and they preceded the French Impressionists. Their work was tonal, not with the same kind of light that you're going to eventually see as Impressionism. And they were very devoted, the Barbizon painters were very devoted to the landscape. And Enneking was so he was definitely influenced by the Barbizon, and later on, as we see, his work got lighter.
When did you say when he was born?
Yeah, he was born 1841, he died in 1916. He died when 1916, 100 years ago, Provincetown was already, as far as I know, he was not connected to Provincetown, but he was connected to, well, I don't know, he certainly was connected to Cape Cod. I'm not sure, as far as I know, again, I have no indication that he had a Provincetown connection, but in 1916, there was a very active art colony, and we're going to get to Charles Hawthorne shortly, that began in 1899 when Charles Hawthorne opened up his Cape Cod School of Art. And by 1916, Hawthorne attracted, through the 30 years that he taught there, he attracted thousands of students. And by 1916, there was a big headline in the Boston Sunday Globe saying, biggest art colony in the world. And that was 1916. That was also the year that Eugene O'Neill produced the first play ever, Bound East for Cardiff, in Provincetown. So it was a very, exciting time, it seems to me. However, Enneking wasn't involved. But he died in 1960, that's the point.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Back. Was there any Native American artwork before all of this happened?
Oh, yes. And Dee Dee and I talked about that. But I'm not, the collection is sparse here, so, but yes.
Okay. You
So
have
we-
pieces in the collection?
I don't think there is many pieces, no. As far as I know, we didn't see anything. Dee Dee wanted to do it because there is this tradition, which we will see later on with some of the more modern artists, of collecting and making things from found objects, which became very popular with later on with Varajan Bogosian and Paul Bowen and people like that. So there was that tradition, but I don't really think it necessarily reverted back to Native Americans. So, but yes, there would have been. These are, these artists are artists that, preceding the period here, the artists, the Native Americans would have been doing, pottery and maybe so illustrations, but as far as I know, it's not part of the collection. And I know that Dee Dee and I talked about that, and we decided that we would reference it by some of the artists that used the found objects, natural items like wood or whatever to create their art. But that actually ended up being abstract. So here you see Enneking, Boston Common, very bright. And you could see the influence of Impressionism here. We're going to get a little bit, the next couple of artists, we'll talk a little bit about French Impressionism and how the influence of French Impressionism and how that changed when Americans adopted Impressionism. It was different. This is Charles Cahoon, self-taught artist. Clearly not an Impressionist, but obviously influenced by the light on the Cape. And because his work is full, and he was certainly interested in the light and he painted the Cape, the dunes, the villages, and what we're going to find when we get to Hawthorne, or even, yes, when we get to Hawthorne, we're going to find that light is what brought so many of the artists to the Cape, particularly to Provincetown, because Provincetown is surrounded by water on three sides, and then they have the dunes. So all of this light is reflected off the water and the dunes. And it is, if you go on a clear day and you go from here to Provincetown, the light is different. And that's because of just the shape of it and how it is embedded in all this water with the dunes. So that's why Provincetown ended up beside Hawthorne and later on Hofmann, who were both very important teachers. That's why Provincetown became kind of the hub. And Cahoon saw that light, and as a self-taught artist, he just painted that way. And these are all local scenes that he did. This one is one indoor scene that's in, these are all in the collection. As we get on to a few other artists, what I found was that the work was not necessarily what we have in the collection, isn't necessarily representative of their most important work. So I then found other pieces, images, so that you will get a rounded picture of who the artist was, even when we only have an etching or a drawing, and they were really an American Impressionist. And we'll see that shortly. But here you see Charles Cahoon in an indoor scene with this. It's very nostalgic. He was obviously a wonderful painter. This is Frederic Waugh, and he did this of Provincetown. It's called Coastal Scene. I keep having to stop this. Okay. He came. He studied. We're going to hear again. A lot of these artists went to Paris. That was where it was. And if you were going to study art, you were going to go to Paris. Sometimes they went to Germany. At this point, we're talking about the beginning of the 19th century. The country was a little over 100 years old. So what the country had been doing since the Revolution and since it became the United States was building a country and building an industry, a community. They weren't a lot interested. Art wasn't a strong part of what the focus was on in that period of time. So in Europe, it was these were mature countries with a rich culture, and so when artists wanted to learn how to paint, they went to where the schools were. And that's when that's when they went to Europe. So it's so interesting. Henry James left America for the most part because he didn't feel he could write in America. The culture he felt was too thin. So he went to Europe and found, an old, rich culture that he could then create his novels on. And in some ways, the artists at that period of time had to go to Europe. And so many of them did go, primarily to Paris. Waugh did study at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts with Thomas Eakins, but he also studied when I was doing the research, so many of the artists studied at a school in Paris called the Académie Julian. And again and again, it was a very popular school. So anyway, he then came back. In 1928, Waugh settled in Provincetown for the rest of his life. However, he had spent about 15 years in England and was very interested in that rocky coast. And so this is not in the collection of the museum, but I wanted to show you what Waugh is mostly known for, that crashing waves, very dramatic, compared to this very quiet scene, which, when you think about it, that's the Cape. The Cape doesn't have rocks, and so, but Waugh was, and actually even when he had settled in Provincetown, he would sometimes take a Provincetown scene and add those, be creative and add the rocks and the gushing water and the drama. I mean, when you think about, that's pretty dramatic. Frank Weston Benson. So we have these black and white images that he was part of the Boston school painters who had studied at the museum in Boston, and many of them were American Impressionists, Paxton, Edmund Tarbell, and Frank Benson was part of that group. So what we have in the collection, and he also did sporting, these birds and waterfowl of, and he apparently, he was connected to, he had a hunting lodge overlooking the Nauset Marsh. It's probably, I guess, in Orleans. And then later on, so he did a lot of these works, but he is best known for his American Impressionism. Now, American Impressionism was a little different. It was, again, kind of sketchy, wispy, certainly full of light, but it didn't have the little precise. French Impressionism was based on using a lot of colors in white to create shades, and they would use these little facets of color all through it. It was a kind of a more, we don't want to think of it as scientific, but it was kind of a more scientific approach. The American Impressionists took a more conservative approach and just really captured the light and the softness, and what was really important about the French Impressionists was they decided, and the Barbizon group as well, but the French Impressionists pretty much said, up until maybe 1850, the fine art was considered religious painting, history painting, everyday life. You saw the Dutch doing still life, but everyday life wasn't wasn't the thing that you were supposed to focus on. So what the French Impressionists did was, beside the way they painted, was decide that they were going to paint life around them, whether it was nature or whatever, but they were going to paint everyday life. And so did the American Impressionists. But they were Boston-based, and a lot of them did these, they didn't do the hoi polloi. They did these very elegant settings, and here's an indoor. And you could see just this lightness and this feathery brushstroke. How different that was from, if we think of, say, Rembrandt, or even if you compare it to what, you know, some of the earlier Delacroix or David in the early part of the 19th century was very precise, the classical painters. So they were kind of moving in a progression toward abstraction in a way. Reynolds Beale, who was the elder brother of Gifford Beale, who we'll see in a little bit, was also an American Impressionist painter. This is the piece we have in the collection. It's the Commodore Morris Whaler of New Bedford. And he did a lot of these boating scenes. And then he did works like these, which are very different from what you just saw, the Benson. But it is a small eye impressionistic, not a big eye, small eye. It's not detailed. So these were a couple of his works. For example, Reynolds Beale, he's in the Metropolitan Museum and the Fogg and the Phillips collection, and he's at Harvard. And he's probably very little known. In fact, there's a show now opening next month, early next month, at the MFA in Boston of William Merritt Chase. Mm-hmm. And I saw the press release and it said, little known artist, William Merritt Chase. Well, I kind of always knew him, and why I knew him so well was that Hawthorne was working with William Merritt Chase in a school on Long Island before he opened the Cape Cod School of Art. So like in 1897, Hawthorne was with William Merritt Chase, who was also a wonderful painter and an impressionist. But according to the MFA, they said a little-known painter, which kind of surprised me. Anyway.
Didn't he start Parsons School of Design?
I'm sorry?
Didn't he start Parsons School of Design?
Not that I know. No.
I thought it was him.
No. I mean, as far as my research, but he may have. Oh, this book was written, by the way. The museum got the contract around in August, last August. My notes say I started writing, I did all the 121 bios, plus meeting with Diehl and making the selections. And the book was originally due to the publisher on December 1st. So my goal was to present the 121 bios to Diehl for editing by maybe the second week in November. So that's September, October, less than 3 months. So no, I mean, as Diehl said, a lot more research has to be done, and I was working on a really very, very tight deadline. The reason was they wanted to get the book out for the 35th anniversary. So that was, Schiffer, the publisher, said, this is what we need. We need it by the 1st of December if you want it out by, say, August of next year. So a lot more research needs to be done.
You can get much sleep then.
No. Yes?
Did this, if this is Reynolds Beale, is this in the collection?
No. No, these are, the only one in the collection is this one.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So what I've done was, and I'll try to make sure you know, what I've done was, this is in the collection. It doesn't really represent, it's a black and white, it doesn't really represent, it's an aquatine, an etching. It doesn't represent his painting. So what I did was, as I was putting this together, was bring some other pieces so you at least have a sense of. So no, these two are not in the collection. This is Max Bohm, and this piece is in the collection, and it's upstairs. Mm-hmm. He was of the Romantic school, 1800 to 1850 was the time. Delacroix was a romantic painter. The romantic era had to do with putting emotion into your work, so it was not only visual art, but it was music and it was literature as well. And Max Bohm was of that period. He was an American, but he spent a lot of time in Europe. He studied again at the Académie Julienne. He actually exhibited at the Paris Salon a painting called En Mer, on the sea. And he won a gold medal in 1898. Now, to get into the Paris Salon, you had to be really, well, you had to meet their criteria. The Impressionists were not even allowed in when they first started painting, and that was when they decided, the royalty decided that they would do the Salon des Refusés to provide a space for the Impressionists who were rejected from the Paris Salon. However, Max Bohm's piece, not this one, was not only accepted, but he got a gold medal in 1898. He spent a lot of time in Europe. He is the grandfather of Anne Packard, who probably a contemporary painter who has been in Provincetown forever. Here are a couple of other pieces. We only have the one piece, but I wanted to show you. You could see the emotion of the romantic style. And here's another one. The mother and the child, and kind of very. And again, thick, broad brush strokes, not well defined, very thick, very suggestive. So as you see, we're kind of moving along into, okay, William McGregor Paxton, also another Boston School painter, also an Impressionist, also studied at the Académie Julienne. Every time I went, the Académie Julienne was one of the most popular schools in Paris where so many of these artists studied. This piece is in the collection. It's a landscape, obviously. Do we have a name for it? It's Cape Inlet. And it's, I guess you might, I don't know, what we call impressionistic. It's not impressionism. And the other piece we have is this, dark hair, dark dress, not very, he studied also the more traditional or academic or tonal aspects of painting. So this was a piece. Here is some of his other work. He was well known for painting these elegant ladies in beautiful settings. Somebody compared, and this painting particularly reminds me, some people compared him to Vermeer. Mm-hmm. And I see that. Mm-hmm. And these, his work is kind of interesting because in some of them you really feel like, I'm a great admirer of Henry James, and I really feel like a lot of these kind of, they're narrative, and you could almost write a little Henry James short story about them. Mm-hmm. So that just, and again, those pieces are not in our collection. I really do want to make sure we know that. Arthur Diehl, he was London born, and he started by what a lot of artists did in those days. They would go to the Louvre and they would park themselves in front of a painting and they would copy it. So he did a lot of copying. And he eventually came to the Cape. He came to America in 1893, and Provincetown in 1912. And then he opened up his studio in Provincetown the following year, and pretty much spent the rest of his life in Provincetown. And here you can see And these pieces are all in the museum collection. Russ Moffat, who we're going to get to, I think maybe not in this class, but next class, he wrote a book called Art in Narrow Streets, a little, thin little book. You probably can get it at the Provincetown Museum, reprinted. It goes from the beginning of the 20th century up to maybe the 40s. And he wrote about life among the art colony, or in the art colony, among the artists. And he describes that Diehl he had an open studio, so you could go in and watch him paint. And Russ Moffat said Diehl could paint and hold a conversation with all the people around and paint a wonderful painting at the same time he was talking. So he was apparently quite a guy. This is, I think, called French Scene. I think was one of them was the Dunes, and the other one was McMillan Wharf. Again, the character of this has a sense of Impressionism. Marion Campbell Hawthorne, the wife of Charles Hawthorne. They met at William Merritt Chase's class on Shinnecock on Long Island. And she had also, both the Hawthornes had studied in Paris. And they married. Hawthorne came in 1899 and opened up his Cape Cod School of Art. They married a few years later. She was his assistant. And when he died in 1930, she put together a little book of all of his, I guess she kind of noted all of his teachings to his classes. And she put a little book together of what he was telling his students, and we'll talk about that. She did, this is one, and you'll see one later called a Mudhead. So Hawthorne held his classes out on the beach or on a wharf in the glaring sun. And he didn't want his students to paint exactly. He wanted them, and I'm going to use the word impressionistically, as an impression, as opposed to real detail. He posed them in the glaring sun, and he had them use a palette knife to paint as opposed to a brush, so that they would be using broad spots of color. And his idea was, you don't create shapes by drawing it and then coloring it. Your color creates the shape. So that there's dabs of color, and that's the shape. So, and he really was against, and if you look at that painting, this is Marion's painting, but you look at that, you could see that the shape is not created by a line, but rather by the color itself. And this is Venice. These are all in the museum collection. That's a pastel, I think. And that's a little bit more traditional, but George Elmer Browne also, he studied it in Paris. He studied the Boston School of the Museum of Fine Arts. He was influenced by the Barbizon painters, certainly, and later on by the Impressionists. He had a school in Provincetown in 1916, which was one of 5 schools that were operating, including Hawthorne's, in 1916. And that's one is called Trawlers. These are in the museum collection. They're etchings. So he was very connected to the Cape, specifically to Provincetown. His studio or home, where he spent many summers, and he died there in 1946, later became the home of Chaim Gross, the sculptor who we will talk about later. And I spent some time in that house with Chaim Gross, certainly not with this gentleman. He died in 1946. Okay, now we're into one of the big guys, Charles Hawthorne. There are probably two artists in Provincetown that are really responsible for the flowering of the art colony. The first one being Charles Hawthorne. I think I said he opened up his school in 1899, and people just flocked there. It was the light that attracted him, and yet when you look at the two pieces that are in our collection, he also had studied the tonal approach, more academic approach, and so he didn't teach that way. As I said, he taught one spot of color against another. Don't do these shapes and lines. But this is what we have in the collection, two portraits, which also relates to, he did a lot of paintings of people, and particularly the fishing community in Provincetown. I want to go to that. So that's one of them. These are pretty famous works that are in, but then we get to this one. And this is the way he was teaching his students to paint. Again, you don't see a line here. It's all, and some, I mean, here you have a suggestion of houses, but you don't, and some of his other watercolors almost go into abstraction. And although he was many years, actually he was born in 1872, and Hofmann, who we're going to get to soon, was born in 1880. But very different experiences, but however they were both very important. And when we think about what Hofmann taught, he taught the similar thing that Hawthorne taught. Don't draw one spot of color against another, or, you know, of course Hofmann had a little more modernist approach. But there were similarities in their approach, which was kind of interesting. When I was doing research, I thought, gee, there's a connection there. You wouldn't think so, but there is. Anyway, he attracted thousands, and Hofmann ran a school in Provincetown beginning in the 50s. No, I'm sorry, ended in the 50s, began like 36 or 37, ran it for about 20, I think 23 years, and he changed, you know, Chaim Gross, who was not, never studied with it, he was a sculptor. He said, every second person, that any second artist that you can name studied with Hans Hofmann. That's how important Hans Hofmann was, not only to Provincetown, but to American art in general.
Just a quick question, did Hawthorne evolve into this style, or was he doing both?
No, he was doing both simultaneously. He was painting these fishermen and the community in a what we call tonal, which is kind of dark, not a big range of color. But he was also teaching the other way, and he, I think those watercolors are late though, but he was teaching the way he was teaching this. But the watercolors that I found were all done toward the end of his lifetime. And I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, he was teaching one way and painting another way, which is kind of odd, because this is the way he was teaching. Everything I've read, and then these paintings he was doing. And of course this is kind of sketchy, but it certainly doesn't have the light that you see, and certainly not that, you know. Okay, so here is, what is it, our second female artist here, Agnes Weinrich. She was one of the Provincetown Printers. Provincetown Printers was a group of artists, mostly women, mostly they had studied in Paris, came to, after, when World War I broke out, 1914, Hawthorne was there, and Hawthorne sung the praises of Provincetown. So many of them came back to Provincetown after World War I. They had studied in Paris prior to 1914. They had obviously seen Impressionism, they had seen Cubism, they had seen Fauvism, and most of them were very, very engaged by that approach to art. American art at the time was very traditional. You had the Hudson River School. So these artists, and the Provincetown Printers were mostly women, brought their experiences and their knowledge of what was happening in Paris back to America, and very specifically to Provincetown. And it was a revolution there was no war, but it was a revolution in terms of thinking. And these artists were Agnes Weinrich and Blanche Lazzell, who we'll come to next, were very influenced by Cubism. The other women were also influenced by Matisse and Fauvism and the color. So Weinrich came back. Everybody, white line woodcut. Okay, so the traditional way, the Japanese way of making a woodcut was to do a separate block for each color. So each block would be a section of the image, and then they would have to register each block and print one on top of the other, or one. And B.J. Nordfeldt, a Swedish artist who also settled in Provincetown, found that process very tedious. So he developed a single block where you could put all the colors on, and we'll see that in this is a black and white. And what they did was they gouged a woodcut is a surface printing, and they cut away, and then they print the surface, so when they gouge the lines, that becomes the white line. And we'll see it in some color, but this is a black and white of Weinrich. And you could see the influence of Cubism here. She was also, talk about women artists, how few there are actually, even as in the collection and as we look through the exhibition. Someone asked me that, particularly in the gallery, the gallery with the older art, are there any women artists? And there aren't many. And even when you go into the more modern gallery, there aren't many women artists because, well, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. So these women, the Provincetown Printers, couldn't even vote, but they could paint. And Weinrich, organized and directed the New York Society of Women Artists, which was in 1920, which was the first women's painter association in America. And that's 1920, which was when they got the vote. So when we got the vote. So here is also in our collection, and you could see how she got pretty abstract. That's a painting. It's not a white line woodcut. Blanche Lazzell, who, I'm just going to move ahead here. Here's a white line woodcut. She did about 100 of them in her lifetime. She was born in 1878 and she died in 1956. Spent many, many years in Provincetown. And she was pretty, as a woman artist and as a pioneer in modernism, truly. She was hardly known. Her work was selling for almost nothing. And then in 1983, a curator at the Smithsonian, Janet Flint, came across her work and organized an exhibition. And now, if you want to buy a white line woodcut by Blanche Lazzell, you're going to pay maybe $100,000 or maybe more. So Janet Flint kind of put her on the map. So it's pretty interesting. Very cubistic. You can see the white lines. I want to turn and point them out, but you can see the white lines. And there is probably, this is a painting. It's in the collection of the Provincetown Art Association Museum. Again, very typical of her cubism, her approach, layering, her colors, and abstraction. Think how modern that was. So then in the collection, here's another one. She did a lot of florals. And again, you see the white line. And how they did it, Bill Evil in Provincetown still does white line woodcuts. And if you go on his studio and galleries on Commercial Street, and he will demonstrate for you how he does it with, after he cuts the block and puts the color on, and he tapes the paper, and he uses a lot of the Provincetown printers just use the base of a spoon to rub it. They didn't even run it through a press. And he uses a burnisher to do it. And each color he would go through. So each color was printed at one time, but all the colors were on the block, as opposed to, if you can imagine a Japanese woodblock print, one block would just have the red, so you wouldn't see the whole image on the block. This way you could see the whole image, and as you painted it, so it's a very direct way of printing. So these are not, this is in the collection, and this is an abstract painting of Lazzell's in the collection. She was back and forth. She came to Provincetown in 1915. She studied with Hawthorne and actually later studied with Hofmann when she was quite old. She died in 1956, so she was studying with him when she was, but she was very, really pretty avant-garde and very experimental. I mean, she lived in, went back to Paris in 1923 and lived in Montparnasse, and she studied with Leger, a lot of the Cubists. And 1930s, she took classes. So how old would she have been? She would have been well into her 50s, and she was still taking classes. And this is called Long Point, and it was done in 1933. So we have some women here. That's a wonderful piece. And that painting, if it's on exhibit, it's often on exhibit in Pan, this one. Okay, so this is the younger brother of Reynolds. And I went upstairs, this painting is upstairs. And I hope we'll have time to, what time is it? Okay, I think we'll have time to go up and stop me if you think I'm rushing, because I am. Okay, so Gifford Beale, we have several. These are all in the museum collection. Look at the skies. And they're the same, you're going to see that next week in Moffat. They did these strips of sky. And the lighthouses are like silhouettes. Okay. Here's the big guy. I interviewed, I maybe a dozen of his students at one time or another. And the way they described him, he was this is Hans Hofmann, was an absolutely fabulous teacher. Just unbelievable. He was generous, he was inspirational, he was exuberant. Chaim Gross talked about, he would go to some of his lectures, and Hofmann was born in 1880 in Germany, so he had a German accent. He also spoke French. And so the way Chaim Gross described it, he would talk in German, French, and English, all kind of mixed up. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it was hard to understand him, but he was so exuberant and so interested in each artist doing individually what their imagination or creativity directed them. Unlike an artist, Henry Henshey, who was a devoted Impressionist and really thought, I also interviewed him, he really thought that nothing beyond Impressionism was any good. It was all, I remember him saying, junk. Mm-hmm. So Hofmann basically liberated his students, and based on, and as we go through, I'll mention the artists that we're going to be talking about, and you're going to see, what you're going to see is the diversity of work of these artists who studied with Hofmann. And that's because he didn't say, paint the way I paint. He said, and he apparently had very kind of, not strict rules, but certain rules and certain principles that he felt were very important, one of them being push-pull. But then he just said that then you go your own way, and he really encouraged everybody to do that. Okay, so he was born in 1880, died in 1966, lived a good long life. In 1904 he went to Paris. Things were pretty exciting then. Impressionism was in full bloom then. Matisse, Picasso was early Picasso. But he was there until right before World War I broke out. And so he was able to see what was going on in Paris. And he saw Impressionism, he saw Cubism, he saw Picasso, Braque, and he saw Matisse and Fauvism. So he had all of this excitement of modernism in Paris. He goes back to Germany right before World War I breaks out, and then can't get back to Paris because he's a German national. He opened up a school in Munich in 1915, and a lot of Americans came after the war. A lot of Americans came and studied with him. One of them was a man by the name of Worth Ryder, who was the head of the art department at UC Berkeley, and he invited Hofmann to come and teach there. So Hofmann did go, and he left. And there's a wonderful story when we get to Fritz Bultmann. One of his students, Fritz, went to, and he was like 17 years old, Fritz was, and in 1935, I think he went to Germany to study at the Bauhaus School. Well, at that point, Hitler had closed the Bauhaus School. So Bultmann then got a room with Mrs. Hofmann. Hans was already in the United States. And so when Bultmann came back to the United States, he ended up as a student with Hofmann for many years and had a really wonderful relationship with him. So Hofmann came to America. His wife was, Hofmann's wife was there until 1939, I think. And she was writing to him, because she was in Munich and Hitler was doing what he was doing. And she kept writing to Hofmann, don't come back. You won't like it here. I think she was doing Veiled. the climate isn't good for you here, she said. And of course she didn't mean the weather, she meant, you know, the political climate. And certainly his art, when you see it, would have been the art that Hitler would have, you know, just shunned. And so he didn't come back, and he stayed, and basically he is responsible, and let's maybe look at, that is in the collection, as is this. So he brought with him the modernism that he had experienced in Paris. So it was the Cubism, it was Matisse, and of the two most important artists of the 20th century who really caused major impact on art were Picasso and Braque, and Matisse. And in fact, I don't know how many years ago, there was a show when MoMA was in the Queens, when they were renovating, they had a show of Picasso and Matisse, and you know, people were saying who was the greater painter, and somebody said that Matisse was the greater painter, Picasso was the greater artist, distinguishing between the two. And I think probably what they meant was because Picasso, his work was so diverse, and he was always changing, and whereas Matisse was just this wonderful painter. And a lot of people argue who was the greater of the two. But anyway, Hofmann was influenced. He came back to America, and he basically introduced modernism. Again, we had those women from the Provincetown Printers who had experienced it, but it didn't catch on. So here we are. He's here in the 30s through the 40s, and a lot of artists had left Paris during World War II, so a lot of them were here, and all together they came together, and what burst forth was the first truly American art movement, which was abstract expressionism. And some people think that Hofmann was the first abstract expressionist, although he wasn't American. He was a German native. But he basically sparked that movement. And also what happened as a result of that was that after World War II, the United States became the world power. And because Paris had been occupied by the Nazis during the war, and a lot of the artists had exited, and art pretty much quieted down during that period of time, the excitement became New York. And so after World War II, when coincidental with America becoming the great power, also the World Art Center moved from Paris to New York and stayed there for a long time. Yes?
Yes, just a little bit of, going back a bit on the chronology. So when Hofmann came to the States, he originally came to California?
Yes.
Right. So he's working at Berkeley for...
Yes, and then I can give you some dates, yeah. He came 1932. He came to New York in 32 and started teaching at the Art Students League. And then in 33, he opened the Hans Hofmann School of Fine Arts in Manhattan, and a year later in Provincetown. And so Provincetown at that point became, because of Hofmann. So some of his students in New York were, and then that summer they would go to Provincetown to study with him. And that's what, that also, there was Hawthorne that brought all of that excitement and all of those students, and then Hofmann came. And Hofmann was there, Hawthorne died in 1930, so Hofmann was in Provincetown 4 years later. Opening up his school. So it wasn't much, meanwhile Henchy was running a school, but not nearly as important. So that's really significant. And he really didn't go back to Germany. And as I said, his wife didn't come here until 1939. So, and I guess things had gotten really, I guess she was able to get out.
I think.
What?
I think she got out of the country just in time.
Yes.
Thanks to Boltman. Otherwise, I think she was really getting scared at that point, that she wouldn't get out.
Yes.
So it's interesting because I think Boltman made that possible.
Yes, yeah. Boltman told me a story. I'll proceed it before I even get to him. But he was in Germany, and he was a kid. I think he went there when he was 17 or 18. And he went to a ski resort in Germany. I guess it was like 1935 or 36. And Hitler was there. So Boltman told me this. He said, if I had only known how bad this guy was, I could have done something about it.
Wow, there's some hindsight for you.
Yeah, right, obviously. He could have changed the world, maybe, anyway. Back to Hofmann. So, here, let's look at some of his, those two pieces are in the museum collection. I did something. Okay. What did I do? I did something. Benton's not here. All right, you got that. I'm sorry. I pushed the wrong button. But here, you can. So Hofmann started out. Well, does somebody think this is representational? But you can see some buildings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he, you know, this is an early Hofmann, and these are later ones. He got very big on these rectangles. We can talk later. I pushed the wrong button, so I got that thing. I'm sorry. And there used to be a mouse here, but it's not here now. Anyway, how many people like Hofmann's work? You like it? Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Wish we had some of these pieces, but they're you know. Oh, Hofmann, by the way, is in. You know, just to give you an idea, he's in the Metropolitan Museum North, the Whitney, the LA County Museum, the National Gallery, Philadelphia Museum, the Tate Modern in London, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and tons more. So he's really important. And what's interesting was he closed his school in 1958. He was 78 years old. He came to America, he was already 50. And at that point, he devoted himself to art completely. In the 40s, Jackson Pollock was in Provincetown, and Hofmann was just teaching. I guess he just thought of himself as a teacher. He was teaching. And Pollock said to him, if you don't exhibit your work, you're not an artist. You're just a teacher. So, soon after that, in the early 40s, during World War II, 43, maybe 44, Hofmann exhibited at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery, Art of the Century Gallery, which was a really showing all of the abstract expressionists and a lot of the modernists at the time. So Hofmann did then, I guess, challenged by Pollock, had an exhibit there, but he was this wonderful teacher, but when 1958, he closed his schools. He was 78 years old, and he devoted all the rest of his time to, and then he began to have major exhibitions in museums. But it really came a lot later because he was so devoted to his students. And the only student that I interviewed was Red Brooms, who said that went to a class of Hoffman's in Provincetown, and he decided it wasn't for him. But most of the other students that I interviewed, we'll see later on, and I'll mention everyone that has studied with Hoffmann. You're going to see the diversity of work, which is pretty interesting.
So, excuse me, so he opened a school in New York in 1933 and one in Provincetown in 34.
Right.
And then did he keep them both through all those years?
Yeah, well,
Did he
New
go
York
back
in the winter,
and
yes,
Provincetown in
back
the
and
summer,
forth,
back
yeah.
and forth for all of those
And
years?
that's what, if there were people in New York studying with him, they would come to Provincetown in the summer. And in those days, it was cheap. It was, not today, but in those days. And in fact, Ross Moffat talks about how in the early days, before we're talking about before well, it was probably pretty cheap, but in the early part of the 20th century, you could rent a studio for $40 or $50 for the season. A studio and a place to live. And the artists that were studying with Hawthorne, they would it would be like, I'm trying to think, it was $7 or $8 a week for room and board. So it was really cheap, which was one of the other reasons that people came to Provincetown. It was a little fishing village. It was very quaint, but it was just this little fishing village. So it was cheap, and if they really got hungry, they could go to the wharf, and the fishermen would give them fish. So, beside the light, there was all these other factors. Plus, the Portuguese population, largely Portuguese population, was very welcoming. A little different than the Yankees here in the rest of the Cape.
Plus you could get there by train.
Yes,
They
right.
extended
The
railroad
train
on it.
ran there, right. I think beginning in the 1870s or something, the train ran there, right. Yes.
It was also very hot in New York in the summer.
Yeah.
You forget, that was a big factor.
So they would study with Hofmann in New York, and then they'd take the summer off and come to Provincetown, which was cool. What?
It's a good gig.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so Oliver Newberry Chaffee, he came to Provincetown, he was born in 1881, so he's a year younger than Hofmann. He came to Provincetown in 1904 to study with Hawthorne. Chaffee was one of 18 artists. And this piece you'll see in the traditional, the Treasures Gallery, is pretty modernist. You think about them, yeah, we see a horse, but look at all that. So he was one of 18 artists who were connected with Provincetown, who exhibited in the 1913 New York Armory. Well, it was the Armory Show travel. The Armory Show brought modern European art to America. The very famous Duchamp, Nude Descending a Staircase. Somebody called it like an explosion in a shingle factory. That's what it looked like. So that's what, and there was Picasso, there was Matisse, 1913. So the New York Historical Society did a show, it must have been 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Yes, and kind of revisiting the Armory Show, and we went to see it. It was pretty, and they had some of the pieces that were actually in that.
And the Nude Descending the Staircase on the outside of the museum, did you see that?
What was
They
it?
did a three-dimensional cutout of the Nude Descending the Staircase, and they put it on the outside of the museum
yes,
on
yes,
the
yes.
steps. So you could actually see the person, which many people don't see, the person in that. You could see the person descending the staircase. It was
Right.
brilliant.
Yeah.
It was great.
That's a great painting.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember someone called it, some critic called it, and it was scandalous. Most Americans had never seen art like this. They were horrified. Where they were used to Hudson River School, they were just 1913. That was like 5 years after Picasso and Braque invented Cubism. So, I mean, and it went to Chicago. It was, the critics just said it was terrible. Anyway, the whole armory show is really very interesting. But 18 artists connected with Provincetown actually showed in that. And let me see, he showed Chaffee showed 3 fog landscapes in that show, which was, you know, and it was a juried show. He, you know, he had been in Paris and then he came back, and he became part of the Provincetown Printers. Ross Moffat again, and Chaffee died in Provincetown in 1944, but Ross Moffat wrote of him, and this is a quote, "He was a modern before modernism became popular." And I think that's pretty modern. Now we're going to go to Rockwell Kent. We have several other pieces of his work. These are all record covers. But everybody knows, we know Rockwell Kent from The Place Next Door and the Cape Cinema, and the mural that he was commissioned to design by Raymond Moore in 1930. And he designed it, and Joe Meisner, who was a very important set designer in New York, had a crew come in, and I guess it was done on sheets of strips of canvas, and we all go there. So that's how we know about Rockwell Kent. But he was probably pretty interesting. He actually was with William Merritt Chase at Shinnecock on Long Island, and he was, show you some of his other work. So these are not in the collection. This is Monhegan. He went to Monhegan. He was very interested. He loved traveling to kind of exotic places like Newfoundland and Alaska and Greenland, and painting. Again, this is winter in Monhegan. Certainly a traditional painter. Did a lot of graphic art in the tradition of British illustrators, as you can see here. And he published a lot of books, illustrated a number. He actually wrote. What I did, you know, of course I knew Rockwell Kent, and certainly from the mural, but from his other work, but what I found out in the research was he was a political activist. And did people know this about him?
Yeah.
And his popularity declined in the 40s and 50s, and the State Department actually revoked his passport. Was there, I think there was a documentary that was on TV, I think.
Debbie, Eric has shown a film about Rockwell
Okay.
at the cinema.
And he was popular in the Soviet Union, and he donated 80 paintings and 800 prints to Russia, and in 1967 he was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize. Apparently the State Department allowed him, gave him his passport back, but he was apparently quite a character. And I didn't know that about him. I don't know that I saw that film. Okay, so here's another Provincetown printer, Ada Gilmore. Very simple. She was, again, she was in Paris. She learned the woodblock print from there were a number of, I'll just throw out the names. We don't have a lot of works by these artists, but these are in the Provincetown Printers. Beside Blanche Lazzell and Agnes Weinrich, there was Ethel Mars, Maud Hunt Squire, Edna Boyce Hopkins, Mildred McMillan, Juliet Nichols, and there was B.J.O. Nordfeld, who kind of refined the one block, single block. here is typically what these artists did, with the exception of Weinrich and Blanche Lazzell, who kind of went into Cubism. Typically what they did was kind of village scees in Provincetown. They had shows not only in Provincetown, but in New York as well. So, and this is very typical of the kind of work that the white line artists did. Actually, I have one more artist and I can't get the yard up. I need Benton. He's not here. Anyway, he's a minor artist, and then I think it would be fun to go upstairs. We'll have like about a half an hour or so and I kind of, before class, I kind of looked to see where some of the work that we're doing here is. Charles Lloyd Hines. Oh, I don't know why I don't have that work there. And he didn't leave me the mouse. Anyway, we can look at his work next week. But Charles Lloyd Hines also studied with Hawthorne, and he painted mostly watercolors. And there's probably one upstairs, so we'll look for it. Very kind of, Benton?
Yes, I'm here.
I need you.
Okay.
I pushed the wrong button.
Okay.
And I don't have a mouse to get it back.
Okay.
And I can't get the last of the last artist.
Okay.
I pushed, what did I do? Oh. So now, so where's that other guy? Do we not have it?
I think that might have been.
Was that it? Oh, maybe he's in the next class?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
This is a quick run through.
Oh, here, you know what? I don't know, did we look at this one?
Yeah. No.
No,
we didn't look at that one.
No, we did not.
We didn't.
No.
I was wondering, well, wait, let me get back into it. This is Hawthorne, and it's the Mudhead. And this is a painting by Hawthorne. So he was painting that way, and he was also painting that way. But you could see, he in these classes, he was telling them, if anyone's painted with a palette knife, it's just thick, just put it on, don't brush it. And look, I love when, look at the colors. Who was wonderful about this was Sargent in his watercolors. His whites were full of reflective color. And look at how, I mean, that's a white shirt and a white hat, but look at all the color in it. And that rather, just think about it if it was just a flat white, how it would not be nearly as interesting as what you're seeing there. And there's that the mudhead. Don't even bother with the face. I don't care if you, what did he say? I don't care if you paint cauliflower ears or not. I don't really care. He was apparently also a really good teacher. So I guess Charles Lloyd Hines is in the next class. Does anyone want to look at any of these again? And then I thought we could go, there's some things out here, and then walk around and look at some.
I just have one comment on the lost white lined print.
Yes.
It looked as
I want to
though
have this bright light. Yeah.
they painted on top of that. They shaded the pants, they put checks into the shirt after the print was finished, after they had printed it. That's what it looks like to me.
I'm sorry, say it again.
On the lost print that you showed,
Oh, okay.
the white line,
Right.
the pants were shaded.
Well, they could have, let's look at it.
I hadn't seen one done like this. They're,
That one.
yes, they're generally quite blocky. But this one, you can see the pants have been shaded.
Well, you know what, that would be, that would certainly be because of the way that they put on the paint. It might have not been consistent.
Even
I
the
don't think they, it looks to me like,
I was just thinking the checks in the shirt.
I'm wondering if they may have added,
Afterward.
yes.
Yes, that's what I,
That looks certainly like that.
yes, that's,
And they would have done that. So when you look at the houses and everything, those are pretty clear, and even,
yes.
but yes, that could have been, she might have
I
just
found
painted that in.
that really interesting compared
Yes.
to the others.
No, there's no way they could, that would have been very difficult to do. Because all the white, when you think of a block of wood, they gouge out.
Exactly.
So the white is and they're painting on they're printing on the surface. There's two types of prints. There's surface printing, and then there's intaglio, which is etching or aquating, which is printing below the surface. So in an etching, typical etching, you have a copper or metal plate, and you're cutting, okay, you're either you're doing a dry point or using, you're doing it through acid, and you're cutting into the plate. And then what an artist does is then inks the plate. Say we're just doing black and white. Inks the plate, wipes it off. The ink stays in the crevices. That goes through a press. Paper's dampened, put on top, and it goes through a press, which really flattens it out and pushes the paper so the lines are below the surface, whereas this is surface. Woodblock printing is surface printing. There's a difference. So do we want to take a walk? Yeah.
I think there's some things right out here and then upstairs.
Did that happen early on, or?
No, it happened at the very, toward the very end. And I did like I did before, and I forgot about it.
Well, I'm going to get to see it on the video.
Yeah, you're right.
Many times the artist does the original work and then goes to a printer who then actually does the actual work on the plate. And this is an engraving. I don't think let's go upstairs. Maybe if people want to take the elevator or really get a sense.
Capture the moment.
They talked about his push-pull. So he had this idea about push-pull, which was creating a dynamic, moving, exciting painting. And the idea was, if something pushed here, it pulled there. And that you were working on the painting, not just here and not just here, but all at once, all the time. And when you put something there on a canvas, and it affected what was there. And I remember having an art teacher who said, cover up, I don't have a piece of paper, but cover up one thing, one part of it. And suppose that wasn't there. Would this work? I had a piece of paper.
Yeah, about good.
Okay. So here, so if you cover this up, so say this was all white.
You just white inside.
You see, and a part of painting also is the balancing, the line, and think about all the movement in there. But how he spotted the color. So you don't put a color here and not repeat it, generally speaking, when you're talking about this kind of art. So it's here, it's here, it's here, the yellow is here, the blue is here, and you know what? It keeps your eye moving. whole, and you really can see it when you see a real painting, you really see it. And I remember one artist said to me, if that was white, and he said and this was a representational artist, and he said, if your eye goes off the canvas, it's going to go to the next painting. You want to keep it there. You want to keep the person engaged, the viewer engaged. And this doesn't take you, when you think about the movement here. Okay, so it's abstract. Does that bother anybody? Okay. We're all pretty forward. I mean, some people really don't like abstract art. Robert Motherwell said when they were doing abstract expressionism, he said some people thought it was just monkeys painting. And that actually is a wonderful painting.
One thing I think is really interesting about it is it's always interesting to see the real work as compared to slide, because in the slide, I thought it was huge. Doesn't it have a feeling of something that was just gigantic? I mean, and all that
This
energy.
is small.
Yeah,
A lot of that, what you're saying, is larger than life. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But some of his things, I've seen other work with his museum, it's like the size
They
of
are
this
huge.
wall.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I know, this is dated 1950. He was 70.
Looking at the lower corner here, there's so much less value in that salmon color than in the bright oranges and reds, but yet it does balance somehow.
Well, because, let's think about it. Let's just test our eye. Where does, when you look at this, and I know we've been seeing it a long time, where does your eye go
The
first?
center.
The center. Here. And then where does it go? Moves up here, right? Now, does that take you off?
No, it takes
No,
you
because this
around.
pulled you back.
Yes. So and this here, this line brings you here, right? And then you come around here, don't you? Look at that. You come around. And yet he has this here, but he still has that over there, which kind of encloses it a little, but you still keep going. And, you would look at that painting and a lot of people would see, I don't know, water. I don't see anything specific. I just see a lot of movement.
I see an indication of the face.
Yeah, I just don't.
Do you?
Oh, yeah. Well, looking at any abstract work, a lot of times people, visually, you really need, a lot of people, many people, feel the need to connect it.
Yes.
They see it. Again, Robert Motherwell, right, they look for something familiar. So Robert Motherwell said, compare music to art. Bar top, right? You don't expect music to duplicate the sounds in real life. The sound of a train or a bell. You don't expect that. It's abstract, right? But visually, we expect, or many of us, because we're so grounded in visual reality, we expect a painting or a, photograph or whatever to give us something familiar, something to ground us. And I think that's why so many people have trouble with abstract art.
It also to me that I'm not, it's low on my list of preferences. I understand what you're saying, but when I look at it, my very first reaction to this particular piece was that it's angry.
Okay. All right, good. That's good. What is how other people feel?
Oh, I wouldn't say so at all.
Okay.
Because of the colors. I think it's strong because it's very structural in nature. But I don't think of it as angry myself. I think of it as more kind of joyous.
Okay.
Alive.
Alive.
Very energetic.
And energetic.
To me.
Yeah, I would say exciting. If I was to come up with one adjective, I would say exciting. Anybody else? Turbulent.
Very turbulent.
Yeah. But we're all talking about words what, Pat, you said?
I said angry.
Yeah, but
First
we're all
reaction
talking
was
about
not
emotion.
favorable. I saw the color and I liked the color.
Yeah.
And I understand the specific way.
But we're talking about emotion, emotion, I'm sorry, emotion. So
Thus the
that's
name, abstract expressionism.
exactly. It's expressive and it's about feeling. And as we go on, we're going to see there was one downstairs. We only have one piece by Jack Tortron. And as we get into this and move along, you're going to see artists that began as abstract expressionists and then gave it up for much more cooler work, non-objective work, very a geometric abstraction. So you're going to see a movement along that, and a lot of them started as abstract expressionists. Kind of gave it up. Tworkov said he, and we only have one drawing by Tworkov, and he might be one of our wish list people anyway, but he said that he really wanted, it was too personal. Abstract, it was really about feeling, and he wanted to get beyond. He wanted to reach in what he felt was the universality. And he ended up doing what he did, which was very geometric. There's another artist, Haynes Ownby, who's here somewhere, and he was kind of influenced by that kind of idea. Again, you're going to see Haynes Ownby studied with Hofmann, a lot of geometric. Bob Henry and Selena Tree both studied with Hofmann, their representation center. So when you see the kind of students that came out of Hofmann, it was like totally different. It didn't necessarily look like it.
I find it interesting that we automatically correlate movement, which is what I think, with emotion. It was the same when you were talking about Waugh's ocean scene, with movement.
Yes.
And how it evoked emotion. Why is that? What's the correlation between movement visually and our emotions? They seem to be really connected.
Okay, let's think about that. So we look at, we'll get to something like a quiet. Let's walk in here. This is Enneking. Here's another Audubon. This is Enneking. So there's not a lot of movement here. Yeah. Colors are dark, but it's quiet and somber. Yeah, even this is light, but it's not a lot of movement. So
It's amazing the effect, I think. I find it fascinating.
well, it is. I mean, I think paintings give you a sense of peace, or serenity, or excitement, or drama. I mean, that's all the experience of what something visual. I mean, I happen to love this one because I love what he did with that sky. And again, look at this, the texture on this painting, the thickness. You know, he just dabbed on it, even there. Look at that sun. It's not just a flat. And you don't see that in the you don't see that in the image. Right. In in the projection, you just see it there. But he was so dark, and then he goes into this kind of very impressionistic. So there's some back in here. Oh, here's a Bohm. Okay, so here's Paxton. Remember we saw some of his really very and that's Bob Hunter, who we'll get to, but this is this realism. So can we compare Paxton with Hofmann? Not very easily. Who do we like? One more than the other? You like Paxton?
Appreciate them in different ways.
Yes. Okay.
And he is following the same idea of keeping you within, you know, you don't feel like you're going to fly off.
No. The eyes are with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so lit, you know, the face.
The light. Yeah. A matter of size. So here is.
This is more the size of
Here's that. And that's big.
This is more the size I was thinking. Yeah.
It's like a
You see the Mona Lisa. And look at the, again, look at the brush stroke. I mean, get up close and look at you can.
So, you had said he was influenced by the art.
No, he was a romantic.
Well, he was a romantic, right.
Right.
But a romantic impressionist, I mean, his
No.
brushstrokes.
Well, yeah, he just painted very thickly. Famous romanticist was Delacroix. And the whole romantic movement, which was like the first half of the 19th century primarily, was putting, again, emotion as opposed to, I don't know. Let's look at something. How much emotion is that written? I think it's an interesting expression, but right. But and look at the way it's. That's the most interesting part of it. The way it's painted. Yeah. Flat. Even the canvas itself here is kind of wispy, but compared to here. Look at
Well, but you also, what you're seeing with this is the energy of, the personal thing to me is also that you're seeing the brush strokes. I mean, that it's
Yes.
very important that you see that the painter is like, I put this and I put this and I put this. Also, I'm noticing a lot of outline, you know,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
yes.
You know, I mean, is that part of romanticism to
Oh, yes.
outline?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly it was the Impressionists that wanted to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But this is before Impressionism.
Right.
So, my mayor, Gardner, would have seen this and seen these, and then they would have just taken that kind of technique
Yes.
further.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, it builds on, art history builds on, you know, it is a progression.
Right. But this kind of brushstroke must not have gone the Paris school either. Wasn't that kind of more flat and refined and a definitive technique?
Yeah. So he was a little bit of an individualist. Yeah. And this is a wonderful painting, and talk about typical and representational of his work. I think this was given. It was given by the Anne Hackett, his granddaughter. Okay, so it is unlike some of the pieces in the collection. This is very representational of his work, and even that gown over there is representational of his work. The Paxton is something he did, but that's not what he's well known.
Right.
Okay, but this is a really good, and it was given to the museum by his granddaughter.
So one of his children could be her.
What?
One of his figures could be her.
No. No, he died, I think, in 1923. She never knew it, she never knew him. But she felt influenced by it.
Look at the beautiful, the curve she makes as she,
Yes.
you know, just.
And it
closes.
closes.
All enveloped, absolutely.
And it closes that whole, the children and the I mean, that's a lot of emotion in that.
I like the white cloth that anchors everything.
Isn't that great?
I like the black cloth that anchors everything.
But you're right, that curve.
It's just so beautiful.
It is a beautiful painting. It really is.
And again, there's an emotion, definitely an emotion to this.
Oh, yeah. But that was part of the romanticism. I mean, the music, and I don't know a lot about music, and even the literature was different than the previous. It was that period. And certainly the emotion came in when we got to, again, to abstract expressions or Hofmann, Matisse. Picasso's work at Portuguese Cuba is race cooler. It's almost scientific. It's a cooler. You know, when we talk about feeling and how we respond to painting, that's part of it.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of what it's all about. Does the painting talk to you?
Right.
What does it say? You know, I mean, I love to go to a museum or a gallery and walk around, and then I say, if I could have one of these paintings.
Oh, I always do that.
What would it be? I really love to do that. need a bigger house, though.
Wall space is so prominent.
But the ones I love, I couldn't afford. They're all amazing. Okay, so there's one back here. There's a couple back here.
Yeah.
Here is, here's a Blanche Lazzell.
That's the one I thought was wow. Was made such a big statement that you assume the character being room size.
So, yes, they didn't work it. They didn't work it. You know, one of the things about the abstract expressionist was taking the painting off the easel and working big. I had the great opportunity to interview with Robert Motherwell twice, and the second, once was in Provincetown, the second time was in Greenwich, where he lived in the winter or off season. And he had 4 studios, and one of them was 100 feet long, and his big, we'll see them, his big, talk about big elegies that could be 10 or 20 feet. And then the studio, and he had several of them. Wow, exciting! Yeah. And talk about emotion. Anyway, so who else do we? Oh, we have. Again, look at the paint here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, my big old pocketbook.
Here.
And the sky.
And the sky.
I like this one a lot better now than I'm seeing it.
Do you like it better?
Oh, it's beautiful.
It is a beautiful
That's normally a
painting.
texture.
But that sky in it, you know, the way he played with the color, but if you get up close, a lot of, particularly in abstract expressionism, was, and some people will look at the work and say it looks messy, but it was about the hand of the artist being there, and that's, you can see the brush stroke, but with abstract expressionism, it's a lot about emotion. And some of the work is kind of messy, but that was part of it. It was supposed to be that way.
Right, right.
There's, so who does this remind you of?
Yeah.
It's like this one. So, and this is, I mean, if you, I walked by it, I mean, it's Kara Yamamoto, who studied with Hofmann. But Hofmann went through that period with the rectangles, which is not my favorite. It kind of, compare that to the small one.
Yeah, yeah.
What do we think?
Well, the rectangles give it a different kind of grounding. It's like all this emotion and this kind of stay.
Clinical.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so it fights with the.
Yeah.
It seems to fight.
Using your comment about not caring for the rectangles because it seems to violate some, more abstract principle. But if you take away those rectangles, I think it would be fairly uninteresting.
That's a good point. Good point. It also
Maybe
seems
something
to-
else could have been there other than rectangles. But
Right,
without-
then we would have had to have more, right?
I think that they do a little something about depth. There's
Yes.
something that somehow it creates this feeling that you're.
Well, that was one of the things that Hofmann did teach, was to create, okay, you have a two-dimensional surface, and this is what the Judas developed, the idea was, you have a two-dimensional surface, and up until, then traditionally we were getting an illusionary three-dimension. And that was the whole idea, to give you a sense that that a painting had depth. But it didn't. So there is this two-dimensional surface that Picasso and probably Braque felt you were violating the integrity of those two dimensions by creating the illusion of a third dimension. Hofmann felt you wanted to build volume, which is what you recognize.
Okay.
You wanted to build volume, not necessarily a third dimension, you wanted volume. And at the same time, which is kind of odd, but that was one of the things he taught, was creating volume without going into the linear or the third dimension. And we can look at some of the paintings that do that. I mean, well, let's look at one that does do that. Sense of the third dimension. Yeah, I mean, you know, take this painting. You can see how artists did that. Even, you know, typically you would see a city street and you would see the lane, that's the linear perspective. You know the street was this way, but it would go this way, so you had a sense of depth. So, but here, what they often did was use paler colors to show a sense of that those cottages are part of the lighthouse. They're behind there. The movement is here, and it's pale. And we're going to we'll talk a lot about that two-dimensional, three-dimensional.
This is like, yeah, I thought this thing was huge.
We're projecting them too big.
Yes, okay.
You can do that with colors too, because the warm colors can be
Exactly.
And so that's painting.
Yeah, that's why they're red.
Yeah.
Color does that. Yeah. Warm colors come forward, the cooler colors are moving. Right. Gray and sea. So, and also there is clearly an emotional connection to color. We all respond. I remember one class I said, well, we'll go around the room and find out what your favorite color is. So we could do that. Do we have time? We'll do it next week. But, you know, people respond to color in an emotional way. Absolutely. Yeah. So, color, not only with the aspect of volume, you know, the warm colors, just naturally, I mean, that's how we see. Come forward, the cool colors go back. And that's also a way of creating volume the way Hofmann. So that's another example of push-pull, more or less. Well, I wasn't sure I was grasping that point. Well, no, I mean, that's more typical of your thirds, you know, and I'm trying to find another.